On a bit of a trip this week, I had an appointment in Sydney. So I'm sitting at the moment in Belmore Park, which is a little place just directly opposite Central Station. I'm waiting for the train back to Canberra. And here's the thing, I lived in Sydney for 12 years, and I'll be honest, I thought Sydney was the best place in the world while I lived here, until I moved to Canberra, and then within 3 days I was saying, I am never going back to Sydney. Now in some ways I kind of dread it, traffic and how busy it is. I never notice because you can get used to anything. No matter how bad it is, you can get used to it when you live in it. I figured that's how Bnei Israel felt. The Israelites who lived in Egypt. It was their home for a while. Just as Sydney was my home for a while. Funny thing is, I'd been away for a bit. It's been a few years since the last time I was in Sydney. When I came back in, I was driving around, and Pitt Street, Elizabeth Street, Park Street, Market. The names sound familiar, but I have a hard time placing where everything is. Funny sort of things. I'm walking around the streets and trying to remember where the places I used to go are. A little confusing. So, Moshe grew up in Egypt. Came from a Hebrew family, but was brought up in the palace of the king. How hard was it for him to go back to being a Hebrew after that? He didn't have much familiarity. He was, read the Torah, it says, he was raised by his own parents. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, but she handed him back to the lady that turned out to be the kid's mother. Said, nurse him for me. And she raised him for a few years before she returned him to Pharaoh's daughter, to the palace. And then he was brought up in the palace. And then he finds out he's a Hebrew. In many ways, that was his experience. He had to run away from Egypt. And then came back later. He lived in the palace. And then he went back to being one of the Hebrews. Difficult for him in some ways to reintegrate himself. But it's an important and valuable lesson. Why did Moshe have to be raised by his parents? Why couldn't Moshe be a refugee who was on the outside of Egypt the whole time? Because he had to feel like he was coming back home. Not that he was going to a new place. If I had never been to Sydney before, it was foreign, okay, I've never been here, but I have an appointment, I make do. But in many ways, I come back and it's weird. I remember the names, I can't place the grid of the streets. But as I'm here, I'm just like, I remember that place. And I know this park, and I'm sitting here, and I'm waiting for the train. It comes back to you. It's easier when you've been there before. How easy was it for Moshe to act as one of the Hebrews, even though he had only done it for a few years when he was very little, a baby, a toddler, before he was taken to the palace for his royal training. And then years in exile in Midian and other places. But those memories stay with you, and it was like coming back home. And in many ways, that's what the Torah is. And Moshe represents the Torah. There's a reason he was chosen to give us the Torah. The Torah is our home. The Talmud says that, or the Midrash says that you learn the entire Torah before you're born. And just before you're born, you are made to forget everything that you were taught. What's the point in learning if you're just going to forget it? Because later in life when you encounter it, it's relearning. There's a familiarity that's buried somewhere deep in your subconscious memory, deep in your soul. The Torah is called Morasha, an inheritance, a birthright. Torah lanu Moshe Torah Torah, Morasha Keilat Yaakov. It is an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob. This is our inheritance. It belongs to us. It belongs within us. It's part of us. So a Jew who comes to the Torah, or a non-Jew who comes to Israel. Similarly, it said that at the giving of the Torah, every soul that would ever be part of the Jewish people was present, including those who weren't part of the Hebrew nation at the time, but would become in future. They were there. In a sense, it's a homecoming. So for those who might be slightly distant, or for those who might be very distant, for those who are trying to get closer, for those who aren't even Jewish and want to be, there's a pull towards it because it's where you belong, it's where you come from, it's your home. It's where you belong. Make yourself comfortable because you're home. Shabbat Shalom.